Let us read our text for this evening, Hebrews 11, verse 30. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. The book of Joshua, beloved, is all about inheritance. God promised to his people a rich inheritance, and he gives it to them in the land of Canaan. And God promises to all his elect people eternal life as a gracious inheritance. We have a Father in heaven, and he has willed to give unto us an inheritance. And to that end, he has written a will and testament. And if you want to read that will and testament, you will find it in the Holy Scriptures. You will find it in the Old Testament Scriptures. There we see what our Father has willed to give us in his testament. And there we see the character of those who are beneficiaries to that will, heirs of his promise. Those who are included then in this will of the Father. And we can read our names in the will of our Father, not by finding our first and second names there, but we can read our name this way: believer, one circumcised in the heart, one who is a lover of God, one who walks with Jehovah in covenant fellowship. Those are the people, according to the will, who are the beneficiaries of this will and who will receive this inheritance. But faith, spiritual circumcision, walking with God in fellowship are not conditions to receiving this inheritance, or even to remaining heirs of this will and testament, but are rather marks or infallible signs of those who will receive this inheritance. And this inheritance comes with a promise, a solemn declaration of God promising, I will give you that which I have promised. And therefore, it is impossible that we should fail to inherit this inheritance. God decreed it before the foundation of the world. God unconditionally promises it to all those who are in Jesus Christ, and God swore an oath concerning it. I will certainly give this inheritance to my people. Besides all that, Christ, the testator, that is, the one in whose name the will or testament has been written, has died, yea, has risen again, so that we have the right to receive everything included in this testament. And the Old Testament believers, they received the inheritance typically. They received it as a picture, as it were. Because the testator, Jesus Christ, had not yet died, but they had the promise that he would come as the seed of the woman, who would come and crush the head of the seed of the serpent, and they would then receive their full inheritance. That's really what the book of Joshua is all about. God giving to his people the inheritance which he has promised to them. But the Christians in Hebrews 11 experienced difficult obstacles to receiving this inheritance, because the world and the false church, and with them, of course, the devil, does not want the church, the true church, to receive her inheritance. The devil hates God. The devil hates Jesus Christ, and therefore the devil hates the heirs of salvation and will stop at nothing to prevent that inheritance being received by the heirs of it. And sometimes his attacks upon the people of God are so fierce, and the obstacles he puts up are so intimidating, that it seems that we will never be able to receive our inheritance, and we despair. Will I ever receive the inheritance which God has promised? And that was the position in which the Hebrews, addressed in Hebrews chapter 11, found themselves under persecution, worried about their inheritance, and tempted to draw back. And the writer of the Hebrews encourages these people that in every age there was a barrier or an obstacle set up by the devil and the world and the false church to try and prevent God's people from receiving their inheritance. And this was especially true in the conquest of Canaan. The conquest of Canaan was not easy, and from every earthly point of view, it was impossible for Israel to conquer Canaan. And how did they conquer Canaan? And how in particular did they conquer Jericho, which was the first major obstacle to their conquering Canaan? The answer is they did it as the people of God have always done it, by faith. That's how the obstacle of Jericho's walls was overcome, by faith. Notice, Jericho's walls fall by faith. The obstacle, the methods, and the victory. The obstacle with which Israel was confronted as they entered the land of Canaan after they crossed the river Jordan was the walls of Jericho. That's what our text says. The walls of Jericho. And 40 years prior to Joshua, the walls of Jericho had already been seen and reported upon. Remember, the spies had gone in, they had looked around the land, they had concluded it is a good land, a wonderful land, just as God had promised it would be. But, they said, the cities are walled and very great. Numbers 13:28. And the conclusion was, the cities are walled and very great, therefore it's impossible for us to enter the land of Canaan. We might as well give up and go back to Egypt. And because of their unbelief, they were not able to inherit the land of Canaan. And God marched them into the wilderness for 40 years, until all the old ones had died in the wilderness, all those older than 20. And now the next generation has returned. And they're in the same position. They're standing at Canaan. And the walls of Jericho are still as great and as strong as ever they were. We do not know how thick the walls of Jericho were, or how tall the walls of Jericho were. But we know that Rahab built her house upon them. Joshua 2:15. Then she let them down by a cord through the window, for her house was upon the town wall, and she dwelt upon the wall. The wall must have been thick enough for someone to build her house upon it. And we can imagine there was more than just one house on this wall. Most likely there were many houses dotted around the city on this very thick and high wall. Nor do we know how big the city of Jericho was. We don't know its population. We don't know how large it was, but we must imagine it was a sizable city. Probably the perimeter of the city was at least a couple of miles. They had a sizable population. They had a king. They had some mighty men of valor, an army. They had much treasure, gold and silver and brass and iron and precious clothing and so on. So we understand that this was no undefended village with a wooden fence around it perhaps. Picture rather a medieval castle with a thick wall, a fortress, a city with a wall large enough to walk upon and large enough to build your house upon, with strong, well-guarded gates. We meet Joshua in chapter 5, and he's looking at Jericho. And he's probably thinking to himself, now how am I going to conquer this city, Jericho? Remember, at this point, he has received no instructions from God. He has the promise, he will receive the inheritance, he believes that, but he has, as yet, no instructions on how he is going to conquer this city, Jericho. How does one traditionally conquer a fortified city with walls? Build a battering ram and try to knock the wall down that way. Build a catapult and throw huge boulders at the wall. Try and knock the wall down that way. Get some ladders and scale the walls and try and get into the city that way. Build a tunnel, perhaps underneath the wall. But Israel did not have any resources to do such things. They didn't have the military power to do such things. Perhaps then they could try a slower method, which would be to besiege the city until the inhabitants would eventually starve or give up. But that would take far too long, and Israel was not in a position to do that either. They did not have a large food supply of their own that they could do that to the people of Jericho. And the people of Jericho, we are told, were straitly shut up. They were not willing to surrender, and they certainly would not do so without putting up a fight. They had a king, and they had mighty men of valor, who could certainly have engaged Israel in battle if they had so chosen, but Jericho's first line of defense was hide behind the thick wall. Defense is the best line of attack. And no one could get into Jericho, and no one could get out of Jericho. And the inhabitants of Jericho hid behind their wall. And the Bible tells us that they were scared stiff. Joshua 2 verse 9 is what Rahab says concerning the other inhabitants of Jericho. Your terror is fallen upon us, and all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. And then we have chapter 5 verse 1. And it came to pass when all the kings, and so on, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant was in the middle of the river opened up and they just all walked through the middle of the river. Their hearts melted, neither was their spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel. The people of Jericho then were scared stiff, but that did not mean that they were willing to surrender. They preferred to hide behind their wall. They trusted that their wall was thick enough and high enough that there's no way that the people of Israel will ever be able to get through. Jericho's walls were a difficult obstacle, and they must be overcome. Because Jericho's position in the land of Canaan is absolutely crucial to them having the rest of their inheritance. Jericho is the first city that they meet after they cross the river Jordan. It's just after that river. And it's an opening then to the rest of the land of Canaan. That's what Joshua says to the spy, or the two spies rather, he sends out in chapter 2.